Great. Thanks a lot, Ron, and I'm really glad to be here. My name is Bruce Costin. I'm a senior infrastructure cloud solution architect based in New York, focused on the Northeast accounts for Microsoft. And one of the privileges I have today is to talk to you about Azure Arc, which is one of our premier services, which has actually been around for about a year now. But if any of you attended Microsoft Ignite recently, that was out a few weeks ago, and those sessions are pre-recorded if you want to go back and see what those are like, absolutely go back and check those out, because we went over Azure Arc and some of the capabilities that it has today, as well as some of the coming capabilities that you'll see very soon that will be released. So with that, let me take you on a journey through Azure Arc. So first of all, the key thing to think about before you start thinking about what is Azure Arc specifically is what is a hybrid cloud solution? Because Microsoft started our position as hybrid, right? We've always, since the 80s, have been an on-premise company where you've had workloads, you've had Windows Server, you've had all these products on your on-prem environment being installed, and they had to be managed through the technology that you had available on-prem for those server workloads, as well as the other disparate workloads that you had on-prem. As cloud became a thing in the 2000s, and workloads started to migrate, Microsoft did not take a cloud-first approach. We took a hybrid approach from the beginning, meaning put your workloads in Azure, put your workloads on-prem, and have them work together seamlessly. And the vision of that is starting to come through in our hybrid multi-cloud strategy with Azure Arc and some of our on-premise services that are now available to you. So the first thing to think about is, why do you need hybrid? And a lot of our enterprise customers, especially the customers that I deal with on a regular basis, focus on regulatory and data sovereignty issues, right? Low latency and edge workloads, where latency is critically important to make sure a service works, leveraging a back end of very large compute power. Application and data center modernization happens over time. So as you modernize certain workloads, other workloads remain on-premise. And of course, business continuity and resilience. So burst workloads to Azure, or business continuity of existing workloads through our multivariate Azure regions that are available, and the freedom to use more than one public cloud. And have choice in where you want to put your workloads. So hybrid is super important to our customers. So now let's think about what that view looks like. Today, a modern data center probably has bare metal servers running VMware, vSphere, or OpenShift, or other various products. Windows and Linux servers are certainly scattered throughout customer environments on-prem. Kubernetes has now become the new developer control plane for scaling large workloads. SQL Server environments are certainly on-prem, especially because of the sensitivity of those workloads, both from a data perspective and from a latency perspective, so that there's huge SQL Server farms on-prem, as well as open source tooling and Postgres databases. So you have all these different control planes managing these resources, whether you're using vSphere's control plane, or you're using System Center or Windows Admin Center, or you're using open source tooling for Linux, or kubectl or kube control, depending on your favorite terminology. All of these have different control planes that you need to manage. Then you introduce multi-cloud, right? So not only are you in your own data center, but you also now have services that are expanding across AWS and Google Cloud. AWS, because they started slightly before us, and there's workloads there that we want to be accommodating to. And then, of course, you have Microsoft Azure. So again, you have a plethora of control planes and management. You have to do update management to virtual machines, update management to bare metal, ensure policies and security posture across all of these. And you need different IT services and resources across the span of your environments to manage all this, because there's no single tool or single control plane or a single capability until now to be able to do that. So these are some of the core capabilities that are in Azure Arc from a governance perspective. So Azure Arc has a couple of different capabilities built into it. One of the key ones is governance. So those governance capabilities are, as I mentioned, the ability to update those machines that you have in any environment, be able to do logs and auditing and be able to capture those logs and create alerts, monitoring insights so that you can capture the specifics of your application workloads and sensitivity, HTTP errors, those types of conditions, policies so that you can actually push policies and RBAC controls down to your environments. So now you know who's accessing them, who has permissions to access them, and what rights those resources have. Like, should they be able to access the internet? Should they be able to use HTTP or HTTPS? So those policies become an important deployment standpoint of ensuring control over that environment. And of course, change tracking and inventory. So if you want to manage a baseline, so for example, you say each of my machine configurations have to look like X, and these resources and services and applications should be deployed on it. These registry settings need to be configured in a certain way. Change tracking and inventory control can ensure that baseline is set. So when that baseline drifts, you can then bring it back under control with this type of technology. And then finally, security, the ability to monitor, alert, control that secure perimeter around your environment and the security baseline of your environment itself with tooling like Azure Defender and Azure Sentinel, which can actually do malware detection, ransomware detection, DDoS prevention. So those security tools can now be managed as well through these governance processes. And this has been a set of services in Azure that has existed for multiple years now, and something that we've been expanding the capabilities of for a long time. But now you want to take that capability that you've been using on Azure, whether it's virtual machines, storage, data services, Kubernetes, and you want to now take those same capabilities and be able to manage those across these environments. Azure Arc is what enables you to do that. So by enabling these servers and environments with the Azure Arc agents, you then have a proxy shadow service available to you in Azure directly through the portal. So you can actually see these resources that exist in all these different environments and manage them the same way that you manage and view and inventory your resources in Azure. You're also inventorying your resources, whether they're in Google Cloud, AWS, on-prem, or any other environment, which is pretty cool. So now you have the same governance capabilities that I already went through in your environments. You can use these log services on these on-prem services. You can run update management and set these update schedules for on-premise services. And you can push these policies down to on-premise or AWS or any of these other environments. So you don't need to invest in other tooling to do policy management anymore, right? You don't need one policy manager for on-prem, one policy manager for AWS using third-party tooling, and then another for Azure. You can now manage it from one central place, for example. Now, let's say that you're a VMware shop instead of a Hyper-V or OpenShift or any other these other types. You utilize VMware, which is a very pervasive on-premise tool today. VMware can also be enabled with Azure Arc, and some of the capabilities that you can do with Azure Arc through VMware is now manage virtual machine lifecycle directly through this centralized portal and perform self-serve operations with this single pane view, as well as those management services that I already went through. So now you're extending that control plane not just to your on-prem environment, but to specific software that you're using to manage your hypervisor environment and directly manage that virtual machine lifecycle so you can integrate that control plane. So, now let's shift gears a little bit. We talked about the governance side of how all this works. Let's talk a little bit about the application side of this and what application functions you can enable through Azure Arc. So today, a lot of companies are starting to leverage Kubernetes when they have large-scale, highly resilient, highly available services that they have to deploy on-prem. Kubernetes has now become kind of that control plane for doing that. And you can deploy that today in your data center. You can deploy that on EKS in AWS. You can use GKE in Google Cloud, or you can use AKS in Azure. But no matter which version of Kubernetes you're using, you can Azure Arc enable those to be able to manage those control planes for those different environments within the Azure pane of glass. So for Kubernetes, we support the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's certified Kubernetes distributions and flavors. So whether that's Rancher or Tanzu or EKS or GKE or any of the various Kubernetes on bare metal solutions that you can deploy on-prem like Rancher as well, all of those can be managed through Azure Arc. We've made those agents available that work on all of those CNCF products. And then you also get these proxy services that are then available in Azure to manage these environments. And that management enables you to connect to those multiple different flavors of that open source ecosystem, configure, so you can actually create a GitOps workflow. So imagine these blue-green deployments that you're doing in your different environments, and ensuring that you have this consistent deployment profile to these different environments. You can then configure that GitOps workflow so you have this continuous deployment happening between blue and green environments, or on a rolling basis, depending on how you're doing your Kubernetes deployment configuration. You can configure that GitOps workflow directly through this control plane and manage it from a single source. And then super important is this operation and monitoring. Now, if you want to use Prometheus or Grafana or any of these other tools, you can continue to do that with these environments and utilize that. But through Azure's control plane, we've done a lot of work to bring those monitoring capabilities that are available in Prometheus on a close to real-time basis into the Azure control plane. So you can now view those container resources and the status of your pods and how they're scaling and the memory pressure and the CPU utilization of those pods, and create these fairly advanced views of that environment and be able to ensure that you have the right resources to bear to manage those Kubernetes environment, again, no matter where they're deployed. So on-prem, AWS, Google, Azure, one single source to be able to operate and monitor, and then finally do this governance and security. So, I mentioned that you can push policy down to these VMs on premise, just like you can do to Azure. Well, through our extended version of policy, you can now push these policies directly into Kubernetes clusters utilizing Gatekeeper. So we have sidecars running in Kubernetes that understand Azure's policy control plane. So you can actually create policies that run as annotations within Kubernetes and deploy those policies within and manage that environment. And again, you're doing this across any infrastructure, any version of Kubernetes that's Cloud Computing Foundation certified. So now you have these Kubernetes environments that are running in multiple different locations that are managed. And by the way, we've introduced another version here, Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is a modified version of Windows Server that really creates an Azure server that extends the Azure connectivity to on-prem. So now you have a managed environment on-prem that you can buy from a certified partner that enables you to run your Kubernetes platform on top of Azure Stack. And not only that, but you can actually push down Azure's Kubernetes service to this environment. So you're now running Azure Stack, you're now running Azure Kubernetes service on Azure Stack HCI on your on-premise environment, and you're defining that as a custom region. So think about it this way: when you're in Azure and you're deploying resources, you always have an affinity towards a region. You have to deploy to East US, West US, Europe, any of our 60 plus regions that exist around the world in our Azure data centers. But now through these services, by enabling this Kubernetes control plane, which can be deployed in almost a single click operation, once that Kubernetes control plane is established, you can deploy these custom regions to that location where you deploy that Kubernetes service and define that as a custom region within Azure. So now when you go into Azure and say, I want to deploy X to a region, not only are you suggesting East to West, you could be suggesting my on-premise data center. And resources would get deployed to your data center through that single deployment control plane. So what does that do for you? Let's go through an example of how that could help you. Well, one of the things that we've enabled to run on this Kubernetes control plane, for example, is the Azure Arc data controller. So this is a set of Kubernetes services that you can deploy, again, through one click on top of your Azure Stack HCI environment or Windows Server environment that's running Kubernetes and deployed to your custom region. And once that Azure Arc data controller is deployed, you can then run Azure Arc SQL Managed Instance or Azure Arc PostgreSQL Hyperscale on top of that environment. So this is the extended capability, right? First we had governance. First you can govern your environment and make sure you have controls through your single control plane. Then we said, all right, well, now let's enable Kubernetes because Kubernetes is this baseline consistent control plane for deployment that can be quickly deployed by users. Then we said, okay, on top of that stack, let's take our services that run in Azure and make them Kubernetes enabled. So by deploying this Azure Arc data controller, you can now deploy a fully baked Azure Arc SQL managed instance on your on-premise environment, just like you can deploy in Azure. And now you can run your SQL managed workloads on-prem through this managed environment and move your workloads seamlessly between those environments. And by the way, you can do this in Google or Amazon as well by using these Windows Server environments on EC2 or GCP instances and Azure Arc enabling those as well. So you can really run this environment anywhere. But it gets better than that because not only did we take these services specifically from the Azure Arc data controller perspective and create these control plane services, we've also Azure Arc enabled some of our other PaaS services, our most frequently used services. And those are Azure App Service, Azure Functions, Logic Apps, API Management, and Event Grid. They're available in public preview, so you can go and try these today. And by taking these services, you're now able to deploy these at scale in your on-premise or AWS or Google or et cetera environments and gain the flexibility of these workloads now having that direct control in your environment with near, extremely low latency because the workloads are running almost next to each other within your environment. Not only can you do that, but you can also now take Azure Arc enabled machine learning. So let's say you're working on ML, machine learning or AI enabled workloads like voice fonts, cognitive services, building machine learning models for custom vision. We have a whole native set of services that exist in Azure from a platform perspective that you can train through graphical user interfaces to be able to deploy these learning models very quickly. Or you can get more advanced and use our Machine Learning Studio to actually build highly advanced custom models utilizing PyCode and pie charts and create these advanced machine learning models. But now you can deploy these on-prem into those Azure Stack HCI environments or into your Windows Server environment that's running Azure Arc. And that enablement means that you could run these machine learning models very close to your on-premise environment. So these use cases are extremely useful to organizations that must have these workloads kind of controlled or available to them in their on-premise center. So for example, if you wanted to do custom vision where you're monitoring a warehouse and this warehouse is looking at whether workers are utilizing certain tools or utilizing tools correctly, or whether the correct inventory is on site, they would be able to use this custom vision solution on-prem where it can be closely located to that warehouse but then talking back to Azure through a network connection from these Azure Stack environments that are on-prem. So again, why does this matter? Just going through this one more time to make sure it's super clear. One is simplify those dashboards and tooling. You now have one dashboard to be able to manage all these environments instead of multiple dashboards. Kubernetes now becomes the control plane. So the Kubernetes, you can deploy your own workloads. You can create these environments, these dev environments at will to deploy your own custom workloads. Or Azure services now become a Kubernetes artifact that you can deploy those services directly. And then IT can feel comfortable that they can govern, manage, and rapidly deploy these anywhere and maintain that secure perimeter around these environments through security controls and policies, update management, and other various tools. Also, this enables flexible cost structures by enabling the differentiation between OpEx or CapEx. So not only do you get that technical differentiation of low latency and controls, you also get the ability to control your financial expenses, whether operational by putting them in Azure or a capital expenditure by keeping those workloads on premise and investing in hardware that you already have or new hardware that you want to add to your data center. This works on all of those different environments. And then finally, the key differentiators here of our Azure hybrid solution is, this will work on any OEM hardware or third-party cloud, as I already mentioned. Any virtualization technology, works on existing virtual machines in bare metal, whether it's Hyper-V, VMware, etc. And it uses a single provider for software infrastructure, Azure Arc, Azure Stack, with a simplified support and vendor management model. So it's all connected with Microsoft and supported by Microsoft. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that gave you a good idea of what Azure Arc can do for you.